Welcome, everybody, to this book launch of Wayne Hoffman's The End of Her, Racing Against Alzheimer's to Solve a Murder. Happy to have Wayne back. You are in, or you are virtually in, the Bureau of General Services Queer Division. Bureau, we like to say, is a government agency for a government that does not yet exist. And the primary service that we provide is holding this space for queer culture and queer books. We are an all-volunteer organization. We do not have government funding because that government doesn't exist yet. So we do have a suggested donation of $10. There's some change in here and I'll pass that around. If money is tight and you would like to buy Wayne's book and or other books, please hold on to your cash and buy a book. So I'll pass this around and just give what you can, if you can. Thank you. So I'm going to introduce Wayne, and then after Wayne does a reading, he is going to be joined by Larry Flick from Wales, who you cannot yet see, but we can see, and you will see. So let me introduce Wayne. Wayne Hoffman is the author of 3 novels, Hard, An Older Man, and Sweet Like Sugar. And his essays have appeared in such anthologies as Mama's Boy, Gay Men Write About Their Mothers, and Best Gay Stories 2010. His cultural reporting has appeared in the Washington Post, Village Voice, Billboard, Out, The Advocate, Pause, and elsewhere. He is currently executive editor of the Jewish online magazine, Tablet. So please welcome Wayne Hoffman.
Thank you, Greg and Donnie, for having me here. Is the mic good?
Yes.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to be at BGSQD. It's a particular pleasure, if I can direct your attention away from me for a moment, to be doing this reading in front of Frank Mullaney's Wallpaper Saints, which I really, really love. And if you want to know how much I love them, I have one in my apartment. And if you'd like to have one in your apartment, you can look at the sales sheet in the back. Frank is a good friend of mine. I love these Wallpaper Saints, and some of my favorite people are some of the saints as well. So if you haven't had a chance to look at those, please have a look. It's also a particular pleasure to have Larry Flick, who can, since I can see him, but you can't, he can make faces at me while I read it. So I'm very much looking forward to it. Larry is my good sister, who I've known for since either of us had gray hair. So it's been a really long time. And I was very, there are a million sad things that happened during the pandemic, and one of the sad things is that Larry Flick moved away from New York and moved to Wales to be with his husband, Shane. That's not sad for Larry, that's sad for me and sad for New York. So I'm really excited that I have the opportunity to talk to Larry today, because I was worried this would be the first time I had a book out where I couldn't talk to Larry. And that made me really, really sad. So I'm glad that that is not the case, and we get to talk today. So I'm going to start by reading a bit from The End of Her, my true crime family memoir, Racing Against Alzheimer's to Solve a Murder. I'll read for about 15-20 minutes until you can't stand the sound of my voice anymore, and then Larry will come on and you can enjoy the sound of his radio-friendly voice. During my last semester of high school in 1987, I missed my curfew for the first and last time, and my mother was furious. I had a good explanation. I was taking my first tentative, awkward steps into a season of sexual experimentation with Heather, one of my best friends. But I didn't dare tell that to my mother. I apologized for being late, but I didn't explain why. She knew I was hiding something. I was hiding more than she guessed. I'd started coming out to my friends the previous year, one by one. And as my senior year started to wind down, I came out to the rest of them, including Heather. But I kept being gay a secret from my parents. As a graduation present to myself, I placed a personal ad in an alternative weekly newspaper called The City Paper, and met a guy named Larry, an undergrad from Louisiana, blonde, Catholic, with a soft New Orleans accent, who was spending the summer working in Washington, D.C. While I didn't tell my parents any of the intimate details, I didn't hide him completely. I told them I was spending time with someone named Larry, but I said he was a friend from the Jewish Community Center, where I was working at a day camp for the summer. Of course, I couldn't tell them when I had sex for the first time with Larry a few weeks later. When I subsequently had a full-blown panic attack about AIDS, this is 1987, a very scary time for a gay man to be having sex for the first time, and took Larry to a clinic to be tested for HIV, we had to wait a full 2 weeks for the results. During those 2 weeks, I started to feel the weight of everything I'd been through in the span of a few months. I changed my appearance. I had a nose job over spring break, got rid of my glasses, and started growing out my surprisingly curly hair. I graduated high school, learned to drive, came out to my friends, met my first boyfriend, fallen in love, and had sex for the first time. The coming months would bring more turmoil as I got ready to move hundreds of miles away from college, leaving my friends behind. And now, while I waited for Larry's test results, I was forced to face the grim reality I thought awaited me as a gay man, based on what I'd read about AIDS in the papers and seen on TV, that I'd probably die long before I reached age 30. Of course, I couldn't explain this to my parents about why I was so anxious and edgy as I waited for the results of Larry's HIV test, but I was acting strangely. My mother surmised it had something to do with my new friend. I don't want you seeing this Larry character anymore, she said. I told her, I'll see whoever I want to see. My mother started to cry. Stop upsetting your mother, my father interjected. At which point I uttered 3 words to my father I wish I could take back more than any threat I've ever uttered in my life. Go fuck yourself. The rest of that night involved a lot of screaming and crying and slamming doors. Still, what followed was worse. Weeks of awkward silence and cold stares. My mother didn't know what was turning her normally upbeat and compliant Zisa boy, or sweet boy, she called me in Yiddish, into this angry adolescent, and I was not ready to tell her the truth. After I left for college that fall, our time apart helped heal our relationship. I was 500 miles away at Tufts outside Boston, growing my curls even longer, playing my music too loud, and wearing clothes she would not have liked. You're wearing shoes of a dead person, she once quipped after a pair of old shoes I bought at the thrift shop. That's probably true. I was also busy coming out. By the end of my first year in school, I'd become an activist, speaking about gay life in classes, helping to run the campus gay group, and doing peer counseling. I also had a second boyfriend, and a third, briefly, and got more educated about AIDS and safer sex. I came home for the summer of 1988 to work at the JCC again. And on my way out the door to attend the annual orientation session, my mother stopped me. If you're trying to make an announcement, camp isn't the place to make it, she said. What are you talking about? I asked. She pointed at the silver cuff on my right ear, which I've been wearing since I left home. You are trying to make an announcement, aren't you? Apparently she knew the saying, left is right and right is wrong. An earring in your right ear means you're gay. I do have an announcement to make, I told her as I walked quickly out the door, but this isn't how I make it. When I got home that evening, she had already told my father that I was gay. He stayed upstairs in the bedroom while my mother and I had the talk downstairs. She cried, not because I was gay per se, but because she was scared about AIDS and anti-gay violence. So am I said. And I'm sad, she said, because I'll never look around the Passover Seder table and see all my grandchildren. I could still have children, I told her. She was not ready to hear this. She asked me to not tell everyone yet. I told her I was already out on campus, leading classes, writing about gay issues for the school paper. I'd already appeared on a local TV talk show in Boston. She was not ready to hear this either. Nevertheless, the summer of 1988 went more smoothly than the previous summer. By the end of it, we could talk about gay life a little bit. The week before I went back to school, the Washington Post ran a particularly homophobic op-ed piece, and I typed up a response. I left it on my parents' bed before I took the train back to Boston, with a note telling them to mail it in if they were ready. I didn't have a problem coming out in print, but my parents' friends didn't know about me yet, and I wasn't sure this is how they wanted to make that kind of announcement for themselves. This would surely qualify as telling everyone. When I got back to my dorm, I called to tell my mother I'd arrived safely, and she told me she'd read the letter and decided not to send it. I'm not ready yet, she said, but I will be. By the summer of '89, she was much more comfortable having a gay son. I started dating Mark. He was blonde, Catholic, and had a hint of a Southern accent. He does, by the way. He also had a sense of humor so dry it could blow away a according to his accurate newspaper personal ad, which I had answered. He lived on Capitol Hill, but we spent most weekends at my family's house in the suburbs. I took that fall semester off from college to stay longer and intern with what was then called the Human Rights Campaign Fund, the largest gay political organization in America. It was my mother's idea. I inherited many things from my mother: her sweet tooth, a probably not unrelated lifelong struggle with my weight, the webbed toes that she'd gotten from her father. But most importantly, from a young age, I wanted to be a storyteller just like her. Eventually, I turned storytelling into a career as a journalist and later as a novelist. But for me, the real joy of telling stories remains more intimate. I get pleasure by bringing a group of people together and entertaining them. That is the most important thing I inherited from my mother. Given her skills as a storyteller, it's no surprise that my mother's decline started with a laugh. On 4th of July weekend in 2009, I had just put a platter of lemon pepper chicken on the dining room table. Out of deference to my observant parents and my brother, who's a rabbi, I bought kosher meat. On a religious level, the difference between kosher and non-kosher meat is a matter of how the bird is slaughtered and prepared. But on a practical level, the difference is that kosher chicken costs twice as much, tastes twice as delicious, and is twice as big. One time your Aunt Marilyn had some kosher chicken thawing in the kitchen, my mother began, launching into a story I'd heard years before. She had a plumber working on her sink, and while she was in the next room, she heard him say, "I've never seen such gigantic breasts." She was flattered. You know, it's not like either of us has what anyone would call gigantic breasts. So she called into the kitchen, "Thank you." And then she realized he was talking about the chicken on the counter. Everyone laughed. Mark and I, who were hosting at our weekend house in the Catskills, had seats at the head of our long rectangular table, while everyone else, my parents, my brother the rabbi, and his 3 sons, sat on the side. What made us laugh wasn't just the story itself, or even the surprise of hearing a grandmother talk about gigantic breasts in front of her adolescent grandsons. My mother knew how to deliver a punchline, stressing the right words, getting to the laugh quickly, using exaggerated facial expressions and gestures, in this case, mimicking my aunt, looking down in disbelief at her not quite gigantic breasts. I kept bringing food out of the kitchen, and as my mother picked up the platter of chicken to pass around, she launched into another story. One time, your Aunt Marilyn had some kosher chicken thawing in the kitchen, she began. She had a plumber working on the sink. One of my nephews interrupted her. "Grandma, you already told that story." My mother stopped. "I did? When?" "About 30 seconds ago." She looked around to make sure we weren't teasing her, and then when it was clear that we weren't, she felt conspicuously silent. Nobody commented as the conversation shifted gears and moved on to other subjects. My family is good at filling in silence. But the look on my mother's face, embarrassed and confused, troubled me for the rest of the meal. Mom was 69. A few weeks later, my mother went to see a neurologist who diagnosed her with mild cognitive impairment. Although he couldn't give her a definitive prognosis, he told her there was nothing to worry about at this point. It was unclear if her memory lapses would continue or get worse. He'd keep an eye on her and see how things went. Throughout my life, my mother's memories tended to be keen and detailed, particularly memories from her youth. Each detail came with a story, usually a funny one, because if there's one thing everyone who ever met my mother could agree on, it was this: Susan Hoffman knew how to tell a story. She had a greatest hits list of funny tales, most of which revolved around money, or the lack of it, food, and her mother. But one of her tales wasn't so funny. It was the strangest set piece in her repertoire. When I was growing up in Jersey City, she began, I found a photograph in my parents' drawer. At just 7 or 8 years old, she recognized the man in the black and white picture, unsmiling, sitting in a chair with a trim mustache and neatly parted hair, wearing a stiff collared shirt under a jacket and a tie, as her maternal grandfather, whom she called Zeta David, the Yiddish version of Grandpa David. She'd met him once on a family trip to Winnipeg, the Canadian city where her mother, Ethel, had grown up. But the woman next to Zeta David in the picture, also stern-faced but tall and narrow-waisted, with her hair swept upward, standing straight with one elbow resting on the back of the man's chair, didn't look familiar. "Who's this woman with Zeta David?" my mother asked. "That's my mother," came my grandmother Ethel's reply. "No, it's not," my mother said. My mother had met Baba Bela, Yiddish for Grandma Bella, on that same trip to Winnipeg. "Baba Bela," she said, is short and fat. Well, Bubba Bela isn't really my mother. She's my stepmother, my grandmother Ethel replied. This was my mother. She turned the photo over, and on the back in pencil was written a name my mother had never heard before, Sarah Brooks. My mother, surprised to learn her grandmother wasn't her grandmother after all, asked, well, what happened to Sarah Brooks? And this is what my grandmother Ethel told her. One winter morning when I was very young, my mother was nursing her new baby, your Aunt Anne, on our front porch in Winnipeg, when a sniper drove by and shot her dead. Ethel continued to briefly explain the rest of the family history. David, now a widower with 4 children, went on to marry Bella, herself a widow with 1 child, and together they had 3 more children. While Sarah was my grandmother Ethel's biological mother, Bella had been the only mother she'd known for most of her life. My grandmother Ethel wasn't the kind of person who took kindly to being interrogated, so my mother, who was never one to talk back to authority figures anyway, simply accepted the story as fact. The story of the drive-by sniper became one of my mother's favorites to tell. She told it to my brother, my sister, and me many times while we were growing up. During Passover in 2010, the first family gathering after that fateful 4th of July in the Catskills when we feared my mother's memory was starting to fail, I drove to Maryland a day before the rest of the family arrived, armed with a miniature video camera so I could record her tracing her family tree and telling family stories before her memory deteriorated further. She was already getting somewhat reticent to launch into impromptu stories, worried that she'd get lost in the retelling. Instead, she let me steer the conversation, asking basic factual questions about family history. The camera captured not only her memories, but also her emergent mental struggles, gaps in the narratives, key details and punchlines missing from familiar tales. A few moments of true forgetfulness when she'd stare into the camera with total blankness. She was already becoming unsure about facts she had once known by rote, which synagogue she attended as a child, or her cousins' names. I asked what she was told about her mother's mother, Sarah Brooks. My mother's parents are Sarah Brooks and David Feinstein, she began, as we started going through the maternal side of her family tree. She's already shaky about the birth order of her mother's siblings, but she remembered the drive-by shooting when a truck went whizzing by and shot Sarah, even if she wasn't sure anymore whether it had been her father or her mother who first told her about the story. Sometimes the story changes just a little bit, she said, meaning that the exact details she'd heard sometimes changed over the years. Maybe she was sitting by the window and not necessarily on the front porch, for instance. But the basic plot was always the same. Sarah Brooks, with a baby at her breast, on the front porch, shot by a drive-by sniper. I never believed the story, right? But I'd never openly confronted her with my doubts. My goal in making this video in 2010 wasn't to question my mother, but to listen to her while I still could. Nonetheless, I could barely contain my good-humored skepticism as I prodded my mother to tell this story of the drive-by shooting in Winnipeg that somehow the family really believes happened. My giddiness rubbed off on her. She smirked as she told the story on camera. But neither of us ever said flat out that the legend was a lie. This was the story my mother grew up with, and she was sticking to it. My mother didn't have a lot of time to sit and reminisce after we made the video. She still had to prepare for the Passover Seder. I ran the service around the table, but she still had to make dinner for more than 20 people. Matzo ball soup, brisket, and a turkey, and a spare turkey, because she was always needlessly worried that there wouldn't be enough food. The Seder went off without a hitch, as it always did. The night after the Seder, my mother Susan and her sister Marilyn were sitting on the living room couch, going through a plastic shopping bag filled with old photos. Eventually, my mother and my aunt came across the photo of Zeta David and Sarah Brooks, a sepia-toned 4x6-inch print mounted in a cardboard frame. As they looked at the photograph, the same one my mother had found more than 60 years earlier in a drawer, the only photo of them in existence, they started to tell the story again. Passover is a holiday that specifically instructs us to tell stories about the ancient Israelites' exodus from Egypt again and again, so that future generations of listeners will make them part of their own histories. At our Seders, we also shared stories about our own childhoods, our families, and Passovers past, so that these too would become part of the history shared by everyone around the table. I'd held my tongue, more or less, when I made the video a couple days earlier, but now I stopped my mother and my Aunt Marilyn in the middle of the story. I call bullshit, I said. You know the story isn't true, right? Their eyes opened wide, not, I think, because they really believed the story, but because no one had ever dared to question its veracity. It doesn't make any sense, I said. First of all, who breastfeeds outside in the middle of winter in Winnipeg? Second of all, back in, what was this, the 19-teens, how many cars were there in Winnipeg? A dozen? And why on earth would a drive-by sniper, if there was such a thing back then, be shooting nursing mothers in broad daylight? And how could he have had good enough aim with an old shotgun to kill her, but leave the baby at her breast unharmed, all while making a getaway in a Model T? But that's the story we were told, my mother said. Why would we question it? Because it's so obviously not true, I said. My mother let this sink in. I wasn't just teasing anymore. I was calling her bluff. But if it isn't true, she said, then what really happened? I was silent for a moment, even though I'd suspected since I was a child that the story was a fabrication. I'd never actually taken time to think of what the true story might be. But I also had a measure of confidence that after 20 years as a journalist, I could find out, and fast. I thought to myself, how hard could it be? I told my mother I'd try to find out the truth about Sarah Brooks and to solve this mystery that had hung over the family for nearly a century.
Okay,
Larry Flick.
there's Larry Flick. Let me close this. Okay, so Larry Flick is a 35-plus-year veteran of music and media. He first made his mark at Billboard magazine as a senior editor for 14 years. He then took to the airwaves of Sirius XM as a host and producer for 18 years. He is currently a music curator for Vero Music and a writer for publications that include The Telegraph UK and Rival magazine. Please welcome Larry.
Well, thank you for having me today, and thank you for that beautiful passage from the book, Wayne. You know, I'm often asked, when am I going to write the story of what I've seen in all these years that I've been in the music business? And I always say next year, next year, next year. And then you put out a book, and I say, because you have an intimidatingly smooth and elegant way with words. And I'm easily your biggest fan. So congratulations on the book. Really, I've read it twice now. So I guess the place I want to start is kind of simple. Where's your mom today?
My mom is in a home in suburban Maryland, not far from where I grew up and not far from where my father still lives. So when all this was happening, my parents were still living in the house where I grew up in Silver Spring, Maryland. About 6 years ago, it was time for my mother to move out of the house. She couldn't live in the house anymore. This is a decision that I think every family that deals with someone with Alzheimer's or any number of illnesses has to deal with. When do you know when it's the right time to move? And the answer is always in retrospect. The right time was about a year before we did it. We're fortunate in that we communicated about it a lot. So I had talks with my father while this was going on so that we could choose, so we could evaluate the timing in advance. So we wouldn't wait for a crisis to happen. We had conversations. How will we know when it's time to move? What will the signals be? What will the red lines be? And when that time comes, where will we move her to? Now, that's the fortunate part, that we had those discussions in advance and actually tried out a couple of solutions provisionally to realize that they would not work, because originally he thought they'd move together into a small apartment, which would have been a terrible idea. Seemed like a good idea, would have been a terrible idea. It was actually Passover. Passover is a recurring theme in the book. It's because it's the time our whole family's together every year. And it's always been my mother's holiday. Her birthday falls over Passover. I'd gone home for one Passover and it was clear the time was coming. And my father laid out his plan for when we'd know it's time, and we all went to look at homes and all agreed, me, my sister, my aunt, my father, all agreed on what the right home was. And we said, great, we're going to tuck that bit of knowledge away in the back of our heads, and we know what the signals are, when it'll be time to move. And within 1 week, she had crossed every red line that we had laid out. And by the time Passover was over, it was time. And we knew exactly where we were going. So she moved into that home, and she lived there for a year until she fell and broke her arm, which is also not such a big deal unless you have Alzheimer's. So she was hospitalized with a broken arm, and it was clear that she couldn't go back to the home where she'd been because there simply wasn't enough personal attention to keep her from falling. And so now we moved her to a different home, which is, it used to be a house. It's just a regular one-family house that has, I think, 6 residents and 4 staffers watching the 6 residents, and she's been there ever since. And she's still there. I just saw her a week ago.
So what do you see when you see her now?
It's very challenging to see her now because there isn't much of her left. There are pieces of her left. Her smile is still there. Sometimes if you can get her to laugh, the laugh is the same. And sometimes the facial expressions, like the way she rolls her eyes, or the way she raises an eyebrow, which I guess are also things I inherited from her. You see her inside there. It's harder she doesn't really communicate per se anymore. She doesn't really talk. Strangely, one of the things she will do is if you start singing, if you, meaning my husband, Mark, if he starts singing show tunes, she will sing along. She who doesn't really talk will sing. She remembers the words to most of Oklahoma, some of Fiddler. That she'll do. During COVID, when we would visit, it would have to be outdoors and we all had masks on. And it's hard enough to communicate with my mother at this point anyway. But with masks on, it's really challenging. And sometimes if she is trying to talk, it's sort of she's muttering and you can't really tell what she's saying. But Mark was singing to her, and I said, I think she's singing along. This is crazy, because she wasn't talking or making eye contact. I said, take off her mask. She took off her mask and she's singing along to "Oh, What a Beautiful Morning." It's a different part of the brain. So what's it like to visit her now? The silver lining is that she's not in distress. The other silver lining is that if you believe that as you lose your memory and a lot of your sense of self, you're whittled down to the core of your being. The core of her being is very upbeat and optimistic and loving. So that's good. She didn't turn out to be, a horrible monster inside. She turned out to be kind of a very sweet person inside. So that's good. But really, it's a matter of trying to get her engaged with anything is a challenge. And it's often music or animals, videos of animals will get her going. And if you can get her going and get her paying attention to you, then if you can have a conversation around her, she can laugh along with you. If you're having a conversation at her, that's a fool's errand at this point.
So I remember when this all started to show itself. And I remember asking you if you were going to write about it. And you said yes, but I don't know how.
Yeah.
And I had a private bet going on with our mutual friend, Michael Paoletta, and about whether it would just be a very sentimental memoir about your mother. And I win because I said, Miss Hoffman has many things, but she's not sentimental. Although I think you're a closeted sentimentalist.
Yeah, I'm a closet romantic, yes.
I think that's the last thing that you hold in the closet next to your parachute pants.
Yes.
But what I'm getting to though is, when did you see that the path into telling the story of your mother and your relationship with your mother show itself? I mean, was it really in this story that nobody believed? Or maybe what I'm really should be asking you is, were you searching for a more pragmatic view or pragmatic path into telling what others would view as being a sentimental story about his mom dying?
So when I started looking into the murder, I didn't think it would be a book because I thought it would take me a couple of weeks and I would find out the truth and I would tell my mother and it would be 2 sentences and that would be the end of it. And I didn't think there'd be a story there. So I never thought about the murder as anything more than an anecdote. But it took so long and the search was so complicated and I kept getting deeper and deeper into the weeds. Trying to find official documents, and stumbling across newspaper reports, and then having new avenues open to find out more, and then eventually reaching out to some 24 cousins around the world who I didn't even know existed, and finding out their memories and getting photographs from them, and it just blossomed into this huge story. So while that was getting to be a bigger story, my mother was losing her ability to stay in the present. So my story with my mother mostly stopped moving forward. I mean, it became my story, but there wasn't really a story between the two of us anymore. And as her memory receded, with Alzheimer's, it tends, it's not really precise, but it tends to move in reverse chronological order largely. You forget more recent things first. And so there was the things we used to talk about, like the news or the movie we saw, or something someone said, well, you ran into them today. Those were meaningless because she couldn't retain them at all. So there's no point in talking about what happened today. Then there was no point in talking about what happened last year. And there was no point in talking about anything I've done since high school. Eventually, there was no point in talking about anything in my whole life because she'd forgotten that she'd ever given birth to me 51 years ago. So the story of the murder stayed in her mind for a very long time because she heard it as a small child. And that became a story that I could keep a conversation going with my mother about the murder for years, long after she forgot what she had for lunch today, or who she voted for in the last election, or where she bought the clothes she had on now, or where I lived, or who I was. She still remembered the murder. So for a very long time, it was a project that the two of us were in sort of together. I mean, I was doing the active research, but I would tell her what I found. At first, she would incorporate it into her own knowledge, and then it would vanish immediately, but she still kept her original bullshit story about the drive-by sniper. That she held on to for like a shockingly long time. Like she forgot who I was, but she still remembered the drive-by sniper. It was, the time it really struck me was when we moved my mother into a home, which is 2016. I used to talk to my mother every day, happily, not out of obligation. I talked to her because I really liked talking to her because she was really, really, really funny. Even when she didn't remember who I was, she was funny. She's objectively funny. And when she moved to a home, that stopped like that. I went from talking to her every day to never speaking to her on the phone, ever, because she doesn't have a phone. And it really changed my research into the murder, and it became a way to hold on to my mother when I couldn't talk to her every day. My mother's named in memory of her murdered grandmother. So there's a connection there. It's not just a random family story, it's a meaningful family story. And trying to solve this mystery that I thought would take me a couple of weeks, but it actually took me a decade, became a way for me to still sort of have an ongoing conversation with her in my head when I couldn't do it on the phone anymore. And now, even if I'm standing next to her, we can't have a conversation. She's not capable of it. But I have this connection. And once I realized that this investigation into the murder, first of all, that blossomed into something much bigger than I ever expected, it became the way I connected to my mother years after I couldn't connect to her literally any other way. This remained the core of it. And that's when I realized that, first of all, this isn't an anecdote, it's a whole story on its own. And it is completely woven into the story of my mother's decline. They are the same story to me. They happen side by side and interwoven together.
So people I know who have read all or some of your books leading up to this one, and even some critical reviews of this book, have noted what they view as being the difference between the end of her and, say, Hard, or An Older Man. I don't see it, because I see first of all, I know too much about you to know that these are maybe fiction, maybe not. But, you know, there's certainly threads of truth in everything you write. But also, to me, as someone who's read your stuff very closely, to me, they line up as the story of an activist on a variety of different levels. Because the thing that's really interesting about you is that you've always been a very aggressive activist, politically, sexually, but you've also been defiantly a Jewish man. And it's become the dominant force in your career after all these years. So when did you start to see that the end of Her was an extension of the activism that started in Hard, in that the sexually explicit language and elements of Hard are parallel to the exploration of murder and the brutal honesty of your mother's decline? It's very, to me, both books demand that you look at something that you may not want to look at. And they demand that you absorb that these are parts of a human experience. And that there's no special episode, there's no Lifetime movie here. Truth is not a Lifetime movie.
I was cancel the Lifetime movie.
But you know where I'm going. So when did you start to see that this was becoming an extension of your life's work?
I mean, to me, as a journalist and novelist, those lines have always seemed imprecise, sometimes arbitrary, and often false. Particularly when you're talking about feature journalism, where you're looking at spinning narratives that tell truths, and the truth of something might be best told through fiction, it might be best told through journalism, and sometimes both or either. I've addressed a lot of issues over the years through both, whether it's Alzheimer's or mortality or risk or AIDS or sex. I've taken both approaches or multiple approaches to all those things over the years. And I think the key is something you touched on earlier, is trying not to be overly sentimental about anything, trying to be direct and create a sort of cultural document about what's happening, which has always been sort of my underlying journalistic impetus, is to create cultural documents so that people understand what's happening for a group of people at a certain time. Whether or not it's something that the reader shares or something the reader grows to understand, that's up to the reader. And sometimes I think that works best through fiction. Sometimes I think it works best through nonfiction. In this case, it didn't make sense for me to tell it as a novel, because I think the power of it is its specificity. The power of the story isn't a woman named Susan who has Alzheimer's. The power is that my mother, Susan Hoffman, has Alzheimer's, and she's my mother. She's not a woman who's like my mother. She's my mother. And the woman who was murdered, probably on an anti-Semitic rampage against the immigrant community a century ago, wasn't a random immigrant who was murdered by a random person 100 years ago. It was my great-grandmother who was murdered. And you can read about it. It was on the front page of newspapers in English and Yiddish across the continent. It was a famous case at the time, and it was real. And to me, that's where the power in this story lies. And that's not necessarily the same power where other stories I've told through novels lie, particularly around things like the sex wars of the 90s, the gay sex wars of the 90s, which I covered as a journalist ad infinitum. But it was a point after they were over in the early 2000s when it struck me that what was missing from all that I had done, the reporting on individual episodes around the gay sex wars, was a sort of complete narrative. And that fiction was the way to do that, was the way to take a whole decade's worth of experience from multiple viewpoints and put them together in one coherent narrative. That fiction was more effective for doing that, and getting at the sort of important truths that had been illustrated by different actors in real life. But oddly enough, even if, let's take Hard and An Older Man, which are sort of the most sexually explicit books I've read, which are pretty sexually explicit, very sexually explicit. the main character has relationships with his parents and those as well. The books may be primarily about cocksucking, but his parents are there too. An older man, the main character is dealing with, in that book, a father who is losing his memory. It's not the main part of the plot. The main part of the plot is about sex and politics, but one of the subplots is he's watching his father's decline. His father, who had been his champion in hard and really stood up for him when he was being attacked by other queer activists for his stances around safe sex and HIV. His father, who had been his champion a decade and a half later, is now failing. He's trying to grapple with his father's mortality. That's the background of a book about blowjobs. So I've never seen them as separate, fully separate subjects, because you can care about sucking dick and HIV and activism and also still have a mom. I do. And those aren't, it's true that those parts of my life are largely separate, but not entirely. I'm the same person. They both exist in me, so they can both exist in my writing as well.
Right. So that's what I was getting at. It's like, so to me, this book is sort of the fruition of the seeds sown with the other books, in that you're very present in this book. A close eye will see the threads of you in your other fictional pieces. And it's sort of like the books read as the story of one whole person. Did you know that was where you were headed?
It took really a while for this project to make itself apparent to me. As opposed to Hard, which sort of came to me in whole cloth in one night in Mexico. I stayed up all night in the bathtub taking notes, and I sketched out a novel, which I'd never done, and then I spent the next 2 years writing it. And by the way, deviated hardly at all from the sketch I made that first night in the bathtub. Basically sketched out a novel from scratch. The same thing happened largely with Sweet Like Sugar and An Older Man as well. Those all came, they didn't come instantly, but when they came as a whole unit. This is very different because it was my life. And it doesn't have an obvious beginning and end point. I mean, the obvious beginning point might be my mother's, this scene, part of the scene I read today, when we first noticed my mother's decline. But what's the end point? Is it when she dies? Is it when she moved to the home? What's the end point for a story? It doesn't particularly have an obvious end point, particularly when you're in the middle of it. Is this it? Is this the end? Is that thing that happened today? Is that the last chapter? Is it something that hasn't happened yet? Was it the thing that happened last year? What's the end? And with the murder investigation, to be frank, I investigated for a couple of years, had limited resources, did the best I could, came to what I thought were some conclusions, and then stopped and just put it down. And said, I'm kind of going as far as I can. I have more important things to do than look into this 100-year-old murder. Let me get back to dealing with my mother. And it was a couple of years later, I came back to it. And that's when I came back to it and said, I got it. Now I see it. It's all of a sudden became clear. I was in Provincetown. I go up every fall to write, and I had gone up this one. Normally I plan it out ahead of time because I'm so excited to have a week or two off from work to write. I try to plot out what I'm going to do. And I arrived in Provincetown with 2 different novels sketched out, at least the beginnings of them. And I didn't know which of the 2 I was going to work on. And as I opened up my computer, it struck me that night that actually it was neither of them, that it was this thing that I've been thinking about for years, thought I was done with, that actually I wasn't done with it, and it was a book and I needed to keep going. And I started researching again the next morning. And by the time I got home a week later, I had much of the book sketched out and how it fit together. It's very different. When it's your life, there's no knowing when you're done. When is it finished?
Well, and that actually leads me to what I was also wondering. When I talk to authors of fictional pieces, there's the part that fascinates me the most, which is the conjuring of the people, and then where you put them when you're either not writing, like when you're just having dinner, and where you put them when you're done, right? Where do they go? Because most authors, in my opinion, who are worth their talent, conjure people who are in the room with them when they're writing. So when you're doing something and it's your mom and it's your father and it's all these humans who you can't put away, how do you not lose your mind?
Who said I didn't?
But
yes.
Like where do they go?
It's a completely different experience. It's a completely different experience writing a memoir as opposed to writing a novel. Completely different, at least for me. I can only speak for me. For me, writing a novel, and I don't know, there are novelists in this room right now, so you can tell me later if this is how you also think of things. When I write a novel, I don't think of it as writing a piece of fiction. I think of it as reporting on a fictional world. And so it takes me, that's why I can't write a novel an hour a day in the morning before I go to work, not just because I'm not a morning person, an hour in the evening before I go to bed. I can't do that because it takes me longer than an hour to get back to the world that I'm reporting on. It takes me at least a good 2 days to get back to it. So if I don't have at least a week, it's not worth my time. I can't even take the train back to that universe to stand in the corner, which is basically what I'm doing, and watching what's happening in front of me in this fictional world. I got to commute there first. So I can compartmentalize fiction much more easily in my life. The challenge with nonfiction is that, well, as you say, the people are with me, and my mother's with me, my father's with me. But it's even more than that. It's that not only that they are characters in the story, it's that they also have agency of their own. And there's a risk. Once I knew this was a book, if I discussed it with, let's say, my father, he isn't just a passive vessel for my ideas. He would come back and say, that's not how I remember it. And he'd come back with his own version of things. And it would complicate my own narrative. And then it was up to me to say, do I want to complicate the narrative, or do I want to leave him out and just report my story? What is it I'm reporting? What sacred objective truth am I reporting here? In the end, what it is my version of the story and my version of memories and my version of my mother's memories, that I recall secondhand from her, acknowledging that other people have their own memories. But it made it complicated to talk about because I wanted to talk to the other people in the room. I want to talk to my father and my brother and my sister and my aunt and my mother's friends and my mother for as long as I could to get their input in the story. But at the same time, all of that didn't go in the book. The book is my version. And I know if my father were here, we could have a discussion about the episodes he remembers differently, or the things that he's sure I got wrong, or more often the ones I'm pretty sure he got wrong because my memory's better than his. But I'm sure there are things he remembers differently than I do. I know that's true. So yeah, it's much more complicated to sort of walk through, as opposed to walking through a fictional world of a novel where no one else can see that you're doing it. Walking through the non-fictional world of your memoir, everyone's watching you do it. And especially when they know you're writing a book, they know you're taking notes and they're like, are you writing this down? And once you tell them, oh, I don't have to ask you that question because you told me this in an email 5 years ago. I have the email here. And they're going, oh God, what did I say 5 years ago? Is this something embarrassing? And the fortunate part is I have not yet run into anyone who said they were embarrassed by things I brought up, even when they were things that were not necessarily flattering. No one has said, I wish I'd never told you that, or I wish you would, run that by me twice. But yeah, it did make it more difficult to walk through the real world you're writing about. Definitely more challenging.
So how much of this book is your grieving process?
A lot. Or the opposite of that, maybe more accurately. It's so easy. It was particularly easy in the years right before my mother went to the home. She was still living in my parents' house, which was horrible. It's just like unbelievably horrible. The last couple of years for everyone, for her included. Sometimes for her most of all. That part was so immediate and urgent and often emotionally overwhelming, that it was hard to remember the good stuff when all you're looking at is like shit, and it's shit. So this was a way for me to, on the one hand, yes, chronicle what we all went through, what she went through, what we went through, what I went through, and how her decline proceeded and how we responded to it, for better or for worse, mistakes we made, things we did well, things we were smart about, things maybe you could learn from, things you should definitely use as a cautionary tale. And I hope that's useful, like the tale of her decline. But more importantly, I wanted kind of the same impetus I had when I took that video of her in 2010. I wanted to capture her before it was too late. She was a remarkable person. She was, I mean, yes, she was a mom. It wasn't like she was Superwoman. She was a mom. I wanted to hold on to as much of her as I could. So yes, this was a way of grieving what I lost and also what she lost, but it's also a way of holding on to what now I won't lose, which I think is more important.
I have one last question, and then I'll stop hogging you up so other people can ask you questions. How many times did you rewrite the last paragraph of the book?
Not as many as you think.
Really? Really?
The last, I'm usually pretty good about the beginnings and the ends. And they don't actually change much from the first draft to the end. Those are pretty fixed. The thing that changes is they get shortened and sharpened. And for that, I have a secret weapon, and that is that I married my editor. So I don't know how different was the first version of the ending. I think everything that's here was there, but there was more that, I mean, this is what an editor does. And then I'll tell you the ironic part. He trims away things to say, this is the quintessence of the end. This is the part that matters. And the rest of this, cut it. Get to the point. Chop the first half of the chapter, get to the point. The irony is that one of the things he cut out of the last paragraph in the very last scene is himself, because he was there too. And he said, and this is something that he would rarely otherwise say, that I'm not the important person in this scene. I don't need to be. And so he cut himself out of the scene. So everything that's there, I think, was pretty much there from the beginning. It just used to be a little more, a little less efficient. But I really like efficient. And I think it ends on a note that is telling and poignant without being sentimental or, optimistic in a cockeyed way. I think it's like the glimmer of hope. Look, this Alzheimer's. There's no happy ending. Like, there's no happy ending. You don't get better. There is no, she's finally turned a corner and all that's behind us. Like, that's not coming. If you're waiting for that, it's not coming. I'm not waiting for that anymore. My father's even given up on that. But that doesn't mean that there aren't moments of grace along the way. And I thought this was one, and it was sort of a glimmer of something that, yes, all will be lost, but it's not quite all lost yet. That's as hopeful as I could get on this journey. And I wanted to end on that note.
Which is exactly the person I've known for almost 30 years, girl.
Yeah.
So how about that? So all right, so I'm going to stop hogging you, but I'm not leaving.
Okay.
But we do have some questions from the audience, don't we?
Let's find out. Are there questions?
Audience.
Any questions, or has Larry asked them all?
Well, I'll keep going, girl.
He can keep going. Yeah, Jonathan.
Well, you said you found out what happened, and you went over in a sentence about anti-Semitic violence in Winnipeg. I'd love to hear a little more, or would it ruin the?
No, No, I don't think it would ruin it. So, I mean, I'll tell you, what I can tell you without spoiling anything is that when the murder was committed, it was early in the morning, 3 a.m. on August 1st, 1913. It's a Friday morning. And within a couple hours, the police had suspects, a theory of the crime. And the newspapers, the first newspaper that came out was the afternoon edition of the Winnipeg Tribune, had it on its front page. The same photographs my mother found as a child. It's on the front page of the Winnipeg Tribune within 12 hours of the murder. And they had named 3 suspects and a theory of the crime. And the theory was that there was a woman named Mary Mostaka who had previously worked for my great-grandmother as a nanny or a hired girl or maid. It's hard to know exactly what the job was. Basically, it's live-in help. She had 4 small children, including my grandmother, who was 3. And that Mary had been fired, and that Mary had come back to tell her replacement, Victoria, you shouldn't work for the Jews. We're from Russia. We hate the Jews. We got rid of them over there. We should get rid of them in Canada too. And she started cursing about how horrible the Jews were. And my great-grandmother came out of the house and shoved her off the porch. And Mary said, I'll get you. She swore revenge on her. And a week later, my great-grandmother was dead. So there's a theory of the crime immediately, within hours, that the former hired girl and her boyfriend and the current hired girl are in cahoots, and they somehow arranged for this. There's a motive. She was fired. She was an anti-Semite. They had a physical altercation. She had access to the house through her replacement, the nanny. Maybe she had a key already on her from when she worked there a few weeks or months earlier. So the whole theory wrapped up very neatly, and it seems like it's an open and shut case. That's Friday. By Sunday, all the suspects have been released. The whole theory of the case has fallen apart. There's no one in custody, there are no suspects. And Tuesday, they have the inquest scheduled where they thought this is going to be easy. It's an open and shut case. We know who we have, the suspects there, we have the motive, they're in custody, and it'll be done. Instead, they postponed the inquest for a week because the only clues they've had vanished. Actually, the clues they had vanished, had reappeared. The only clue in the case was no longer a clue. They put it off for a week, put it off for another week, and then come up empty, nothing. So the immediate theory of the case is anti-Semitism. That's motivated by, in large part, if not entirely, by anti-Semitism. So the north end of Winnipeg at the time was, in some ways, a parallel to the Lower East Side of New York, in that you had enormous numbers of Eastern European immigrants arriving at once and living in the same sort of rundown neighborhoods. They were largely, both of them, largely Jewish neighborhoods, which is to say almost all the Jewish immigrants lived in those neighborhoods. But the neighborhoods also included lots of non-Jewish immigrants, including their neighbors from Ukraine, Russia, Poland, Galicia. Basically all the people they had fled from during the pogroms also came over with them and lived next door to them here as well. The main difference being that in New York, when people arrived, when my other ancestors arrived in New York and lived in Manhattan, at that point, they were living in a global metropolis of millions. And when people arrived in Winnipeg, they were living in a frontier city that was about 20 years old, 25 years old, that had maybe 100,000 immigrants, 100,000 residents. And 10,000 Jewish immigrants came within the span of a few years to add to the city of 100,000. And tens of thousands more non-Jewish Eastern European immigrants arrived at the same time. You basically double the size of the city in a decade. And the city is hugely immigrant heavy. And they've arrived in a city where the police and the journalists don't speak any language but English, so they can't even communicate with or report on or investigate crimes in these communities. It's really a blank. So anti-Semitism is rife in the north end of Winnipeg. This murder is not the only instance of an anti-Semitic attack or crime. Whether or not that ultimately turns out to be what happened, I'll leave it to you to decide when you read the book, but that's the initial theory is anti-Semitism. And even if that isn't what ultimately motivated the crime, it is so plausible that it's the first thing that comes to mind of non-Jewish journalists and police detectives alike immediately, that this is about anti-Semitism, because that's how prevalent the sentiment was in the north end.
There's also, isn't there also just when it comes to these assumptions, a degree of overcorrection of people who have had to deal with bias issues and bias crimes. So they reach for that thing that will make them look like they are being more reasonable and human, as opposed to looking for something a little bit more sinister.
It's also in some ways a question of which immigrants were at the bottom of the barrel for the establishment. And it seems like the Jewish immigrants were not at the bottom of the barrel. They were one step above the non-Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. So even if they didn't really care about anti-Semitism or Jewish lives, because they didn't particularly, or there's no reason to believe they did, they certainly believed that the other non-Jewish Eastern European immigrants were not good people. And the bias comes out in the reporting pretty clearly. And the bias against Jews comes out clearly where the reporters and detectives keep saying, you can't really take at face value what those people tell you on the street because they are overly excitable and they talk a lot and they gossip a lot, and that's just who they are. The Jews are overly excited, which is, just because it's true doesn't mean you should say it out loud. But at the same time, the bias against the other immigrants comes through where one of the initial suspects, like I said, it was the former nanny and the current nanny, and the former nanny's boyfriend. It's a man named Stefan Kashowski. 2 of the 3 daily newspapers peg him right away. They said, he's the one, he's the gunman. They believe the women are involved, but they don't believe the women pulled the trigger because that just almost never happened. It was men who pulled triggers. So it was him, the boyfriend, Stefan Kashowski. One newspaper comes out in his defense and says, we don't believe Stefan Kashowski is guilty. But why? They said, and I'll clean it up just a tiny bit. They said, this crime was an act of cunning. It was carefully planned. And he's a Galician, which we would call a Pole. He's Polish, and those people are too stupid to commit a cunning crime. So those dumb, swarthy Poles could never have crafted such a sinister plot. So that's why we don't believe he's guilty, because they're too dumb. So this is where the biases lay at the time. So yes, there may have been overcorrection around anti-Semitism, but it was also because the people they could pin it on were people they also didn't value. If it were a case of, let's say, English Lutherans in Winnipeg, I doubt they would have stacked up as neatly against the Jewish immigrants. But the Polish immigrants who weren't Jewish certainly stacked up as the people we like even less.
Right. Because there is, whether people even in current society want to admit it, there is a pecking order.
Yes, and the pecking order in Winnipeg at the time was changing so fast.
Yeah.
Because like I said, the number of people coming in was large, but also the city was quite small. So the changes to the city were enormous. They really can't be overstated. When my great-grandparents arrived, one in 1906 and one in 1904, they were in the first wave of Jewish immigration to Canada. The prime minister had decided to establish a Jew colony. He invited Russian Jews to come over and get land, and they said, we don't care that it's freezing cold in Russia too, we'll take the free land. And they came to Winnipeg. There was no Jewish infrastructure in Winnipeg in 1904, like none, nothing. There were no synagogues. Within a decade, there are less than a decade, by 1913, there are more than a dozen synagogues in one neighborhood. There's a school, a Jewish cemetery, a Jewish orphanage. There's a Jewish councilman by that point. There's a Yiddish newspaper. They've created an entire community infrastructure almost overnight. So they've really come in and changed things incredibly rapidly. The things that my great-grandparents are facing in 1913 at the time of the murder, they're no resemblance to what they could have been facing in 1904 and 1906 when they arrived. Completely different understanding. The only thing that hadn't changed is the English papers and the police department still didn't have any Yiddish speakers on them.
So before we go to another question, I want to follow up one more thing though. As you're writing this book, obviously you've devoted a lot of your life and a lot of your work to your identity as a gay man and to your politics as a gay man and your sexuality as a gay man. How did working on this book uh, digging into this case, exploring your mother's life, how much did that alter your view of yourself as a Jewish man?
You know, what changed as I was researching the book is it filled in a lot of blanks. Oh, really a lot of blanks. Like a lot of North American Jews, our family history really only goes back a century, because you can't really trace it back to Europe much, because anyone who stayed was murdered, and anyone who came over didn't want to talk about Europe anymore, almost not at all. So there's almost no continuity. I can go back 2 to 3 generations pretty easily, and really that's it. Now I can go back 4. I can go back 1 more generation in Europe on one side. But it's very hard to trace history very far back. So the stories I had were few and far between. And my grandmother, who was a 3-year-old when her mother was murdered, she didn't tell a lot of stories about Winnipeg even. And she didn't tell any stories about her mother other than this bullshit story about the drive-by sniper, which is an entertaining but very short story. And that's sort of the only thing we ever heard about her mother. That's it. And since my grandmother had moved to the States and the rest of her family stayed in Canada, I never saw them. I never met them. Maybe I met 1 or 2 at my brother's bar mitzvah once when I was a kid. So there were all these ruptures in family history. Like, I knew my grandmother as an adult. She lived with us. I didn't know where she came from, really. I didn't know much about Winnipeg. She never told stories. I didn't really know what happened to her mother, except this bullshit story I never believed. I didn't know whatever happened to her father or her siblings or my cousins who I'd never met or heard of, because we never saw them. So researching this filled in a lot of blanks in terms of creating continuity for the family history. Again, it only goes back so far, but now I can fill it in. But along the way, there were the things I expected and the things I didn't expect. The things I expected was I would learn more about where my grandmother grew up in Winnipeg. I would learn more about what happened to my great-grandfather after his wife was murdered, how he remarried, and how that blended family came to be, and why and when they moved from Winnipeg to Vancouver, which I knew they had done at some point in the past century, but I didn't know when or why. So I could fill in those blanks. The parts I never knew were things like finding out that my great-grandfather actually was a cattle dealer who lived not in Winnipeg, but in rural Saskatchewan for years. And that after he remarried, he relocated the whole family. My grandmother spent half her childhood in a town of 1,000 on the frontier in the prairies of Saskatchewan. She never mentioned this to anybody, including her children. Half her childhood, from age 7 to age 14, she lived in the middle of Saskatchewan, in the middle of nowhere, Saskatchewan. And my great-grandfather was a cowboy, and his brothers broke horses for the Mounties. And they were bootleggers who were arrested in tax fraud cases and were almost certainly involved with organized crime. None of this was anywhere on my radar of things I would find out about. I thought I'd find out, like, oh, which synagogue my great-grandfather went to, not he was a cowboy. What? What, they were making gin in the barn? What? They lived in Saskatchewan? Why? I never thought I'd find that out. And along the way, I found out the context. Why did he live in Saskatchewan? Why were they working with horses? Why were they maybe, making liquor in the barn? What the context for all that was among, in particular, Jewish immigrants to Canada, in particular, Jewish immigrants to Western Canada at the time, because they weren't loners. They were part of a community that was doing these things. It was involved with things like horses and cattle and illegal booze and probably tax evasion, and a couple of murders and some splintered families and blended families. There's a much more non-linear story that I did not expect to uncover that I did uncover.
So how does all of this fold into your identity as a gay man? In that, a lot of, it may be generational. I may be speaking of my generation as a 50-something-year-old gay man. As someone I was raised Catholic, I was, in an Italian family, and most of my contact with other gay men, particularly gay men, but queer people in general, is a feeling of rejection because of religion, and that shuts the door, or the interest in opening the door to learning all of the things that you're talking about here, right? So that a lot of queer people go through their lives. There may even be people sitting in that room right now with you who are thinking, I don't know any of this stuff about my family, because they felt like they weren't welcome to be even knowing about it. But you, like I said, you've always been this. Your identity as a Jewish man has always been, from my point of view, as powerful a force as being a gay man has been.
Yeah.
And so, how does this experience now fold into your gay life?
So part of it has to do with the nature of Judaism, particularly in America, which is to say, now I'm going to speak in hideous generalities, so just pardon me for a moment. Judaism in America today, in the past 50 years, 100 years, is so thick, it's so layered with so many different elements that you can literally carve religion out of it entirely and still be left with an entire rich identity, which is in fact what I did as a teenager. My sort of practice run for coming out as a gay man was coming out as an atheist, which I did when I was 13, which also did not go over well. Which is funny because I don't know that my father believes in God. I don't know that my brother, the rabbi, does either. And I know that my grandfather didn't. And it's actually not a big deal in the Jewish community. It's not a religion based in faith or belief in that way. So, but when I came out as an atheist, the point of it wasn't just to shock my parents. The point of it was to say, I know you have a path laid out for me. And that path was going to Hebrew school and going to synagogue all the time. We kept kosher at home. We observed every holiday. We were traditional conservative, capital C conservative Jewish family. And that I'd be bar mitzvah, and after my bar mitzvah, I would go on to be confirmed at age 16, and I would continue my education. My brother had done it, my sister had done it, and now I was bar mitzvah. It was my turn. And then I said to my parents, I'm done. I went with you up to here. I'm an atheist. I'm done with synagogue. Who am I praying to? What's the point? And no, I'm not going to get confirmed. And this is where I got off this ride. And they were certainly taken aback. But I think when they realized, no, I was still going to Jewish summer camp. I was still going to work at the JCC. I was still going to make Hamantasha for Purim. I wasn't giving up those things. I just wasn't going to be praying anymore. I wasn't, and also, by the way, my father, when I worked for my father after college for a couple of years, my father ran a daily minyan, a daily prayer service every day at noon. It's a 10-minute service. And I went because they needed 10 people to count so they could have a minyan. And I went because it was my father and it was meaningful to him. And I went. And I didn't pray. I stood in the corner. It didn't really matter to him. I'm sure he would have been happier if I had said something. But the important thing is that I went so that he could do what he needed to do. So once they realized that I wasn't rejecting them or even rejecting the path, I was just cutting something out of the middle. That made it possible for me to stay involved in the Jewish community after I came out. Because to be frank, I didn't give a shit what the rabbis saw it. By the way, I still don't. I don't care. It doesn't bother me. I mean, so I can't come to your synagogue? Boo-hoo, like I wasn't going anywhere. So that never mattered to me. And I had made a decision years ago. I sort of once I went off to college, I drifted away from most practice because I was living on my own. I didn't have to do anything I didn't want to do anymore. And then I found the things that I missed and took them back on my own terms. And it became a way of saying, I'm Jewish, and I don't really care if you don't believe that what I'm doing is valid, because I do, and that's the only vote that matters. And if you don't like it, like, go cry in your pie. I don't care. And I think that helped me be able to hold on to a Jewish identity as a gay man. They never seemed at odds to me, even when the conservative movement I grew up in was pretty crappy for a really long time, until recently. They are now, by the way, much, much better. To me, like, congratulations, you're 25 years too late, but welcome to the party. But I could have found a different religion, a religious sect. I could have found a different part of Judaism where I was more welcome as a gay man from the beginning, except I didn't want to. That wasn't the part that was meaningful to me. So I never felt like I had to play down my gayness as a Jew, because anyone who thought that invalidated me as a Jew, well, like up yours. I don't care. It doesn't matter what you think. I get the vote. And my vote is I'm still Jewish. And I can be an atheist who ironically runs the life and religion section of a major Jewish magazine. Because just because I'm an atheist doesn't mean I don't understand what people with religious beliefs are going through. I get it. You want to talk about Torah? I was a Bible scholar. I'll go head to head with you. It's fine. I'll do it. You want to read over prayers in Hebrew? I can read them too. I know them by heart. Let's go. I have all that. I grew up with all that. So just because I put it aside doesn't mean I forgot it. And it doesn't mean that I ever felt the need to choose. I never did. And anyone who tells me I need to can, go sit on it. I'm not gonna.
So does anyone there have a question?
Yeah.
Roz.
So I was listening to you, I was thinking that in a way, it was a wonderful coincidence that they thought they solved this murder. They had the people in mind and didn't have it, they had the clue, but didn't have it. Very much like your mother had this memory,
Yeah.
someone else had the memory. These two parallel tracks, which I haven't read the book, but I'm sure it definitely bring together. But it really wouldn't, to me, it might have been much harder for it to work if everything was clear about the murder.
It definitely would have been harder if everything had been clear. First of all, it would have been a very short book. It would have been like a pamphlet. But also, this is, as a journalist, I'm going to speak in broad generalities again because I love to do that. As a journalist, I'm used to having an assignment that you get, and you have a deadline, and you meet the deadline, you do the best you can on the deadline, and then you turn it in, and it comes out the next day, and then you get paid hopefully the next week, and then you're on to the next story, and it's behind you, like done, next. Part of the beauty of writing it as a book is that there is no deadline because the world's not waiting for a book. It's just not. You can put one out, but the world's not pulling it out of you. So I could take as long as I wanted. My agent's sitting in the back and he's probably going, I wish you hadn't taken quite this long, but it took as long as I wanted. Thank you for being patient, Mitchell. And it worked out well in the end because there were multiple times, not just in terms of the murder, but also sort of subsidiary mysteries in the book. Like one of my grandmother's sisters disappears from the family narrative and I never knew what happened to her. And I tried to find that out too. It's a secondary mystery to solve. And also things that came up with my mother. And there are several points where I either reached conclusions or hit dead ends and gave up. And if I had needed to publish the book then, I would have reached these conclusions or hit dead ends and given up, and I would have had that much. I wound up stepping away from the research for a couple of years and coming back to it. It was always in fits and starts because I have a job, but it was always in fits and starts. I actually put it aside completely for 2 years. When I came back, the dead ends opened up somewhat through happenstance, or maybe it was Bashir, maybe it was meant to be. But things I thought were dead ends suddenly opened. And things I thought I had wrapped up with conclusions, I realized I was wrong. And I had the time to go back and look at them a second time and either start over or back up and go down a different path in the maze and find myself at a different destination, which I would never, again, have had time to do. If I had to tell you, after 12 months, what I thought had happened, I would have turned into a very, very different thing. I could have stopped after I found the first newspaper article because, again, it seemed so clear cut. I could have told you what happened, except it was all wrong. Like it all fell apart within 48 hours. So it's a real luxury to be able to go back and rethink and reinvestigate and relook at things, because it was really the second time around that light bulbs started going off. I said, I can't believe I didn't see this 3 years ago. But that's because we've all done this. You're in the middle of researching something and you just keep moving forward. And it's only when you step back that you can look at the whole picture and say, that was a detour. I shouldn't have taken that detour. What if I didn't take that detour? Let me go through this maze again. Oh, this makes much more sense. Or going back over a new piece of evidence that I didn't have before from a new newspaper article and realizing, now I have a different idea. So yeah, watching those things unravel and re-ravel was really rewarding. Anyone else? Larry Flick.
Well, let me ask you one more question before we bring this in for a landing there.
Sure.
As you you kind of lock into this mode of talking about the book, talking a lot about your mother, has it created a buffer of safety, emotional safety from the inevitable moment?
No, because I think it's redefined what the inevitable moment is. It's, you know, as I walked back through the timeline of dealing with my mother and watching her decline, there are so many important moments along the way that the notion that it's all leading toward one final conclusion, which I assume is her demise, that's actually not it. I mean, at some point she will die and I'll be very sad. I don't mean that glibly. I'll be very, very sad to lose her. Except in almost every way, I lost her already. And those moments were devastating. Like those were crushing. And going back over them to write the book, and going back over them when I do readings like this, is sometimes remembering that I've already hit those points. Like they're already behind me. And at some points realizing I didn't even realize when I was going through it, that that was the moment of crisis or catharsis or change of heart or epiphany. But now I realize, looking back on it, that's the moment everything changed. So that's the moment that I finally let go. There's a scene where it's a relative, my mother's still living at home. This is, I think, 2013. So we're a few years into her decline. And it's Yom Kippur. And I'm up at our house with my husband in Catskills. We live across the street from the synagogue, which I do not go to. It's like the joke about the synagogue on a desert island, except I don't go to any of them. And it's Yom Kippur, and my mother calls in the middle of the day, which was strange because she wasn't really making phone calls at that point, but she called me on my cell phone, which she had never done. And I answer the phone and she says, where's Dad? Oh no, sorry, where's Mom? And I said, where's Mom? Who's Mom? She said, my mom. I said, oh, where's your mom? She's in the ground in King David Memorial Gardens in Virginia. She said, oh, how about my dad? I said, Staten Island, 1977. I said, okay. Why are you asking me where your parents are? She said, because we're in their house right now and your father's upstairs asleep and I want to make sure he's up before they get home. I said, okay, that's crazy. Your parents, I said, it's your house, first of all. She said, since when? I said, since I was a baby. I said, your parents never lived in a house, they lived in apartments. She said, right, that's right. This is the point where she could still internalize logic and reason, have a back and forth. She wasn't stressed out about it. She just wanted information. And she's very calm. And she said, I knew you'd have the answers. That's why I called you. And she perfectly calmly hung up after I just told her, yeah, your parents are both long dead, like 30, 40 years ago, they're dead. Said, I knew you'd know the answer. Thank you very much. And she hung up the phone. And Mark is sitting on the couch watching me have this insane conversation, wondering what is exactly happening. And that's when I stood in the doorway and just broke down crying. And I realized, oh, that's the first, it was only when I was writing the book that I realized, right, that's the moment it hit me. That 4 years into her diagnosis is the first time it hit me like, oh shit, here comes the really bad part of the ride. It's like when you get on a roller coaster and the first part is kind of gentle and you go over a little curve and you're like, oh, scary. And you go over a little bumpy, like, woo, throw your hands in the air. And then here comes the 200-foot drop. And that's also when you look ahead and you're like, oh shit, 800 more 200-foot drops are right ahead of me. It was that moment. And I didn't realize at the time. I knew I was crying, obviously, but it didn't occur to me that that's the moment when it hit me, what I was in for. So yeah, it didn't create an emotional safety zone. It created more of an emotional map of where I'd been and how it felt and when, which is very useful, by the way. For going back, I can see clearly now what the things were that made it very real. Which parts seemed funny, because there are parts of it that are funny. There are parts of watching someone with Alzheimer's that are really, really, really funny. And you have to hold on to those too. But yeah, I think it more was like mapping out the emotional topography of the journey as opposed to creating a zone of safety. I don't think there's a zone of safety there.
Well, folks, that's Wayne Hoffman. The book is called The End of Her.
I'm sorry, I have another question.
Oh, well.
Yes, Mitchell.
What are you working on now?
Oh God, my agents asked me what I'm working on. What is always possible, this fall I will do the same thing as I have done in previous years. I will go to Provincetown and take time off from work to write. And either by that point I will have figured out what's next, or I will sit there until whatever's next speaks to me. I stay in this tiny cottage, this one-room cottage, and it has been a sort of magical place of realization where ideas come to me. Like it's the tiniest room you've ever seen. But hopefully that's where it will become evident. There's the two things I had open on my desk back when I started this are still open. So maybe one of those will finally call out to me. Maybe. I'll see. I'll let you know. I'll call you. I'll tell you. Sorry.
Is that it? Are we ready to say good day to everybody?
We're ready to say farewell.
All right. Well, again, that is Wayne Hoffman. The book is called The End of Her. If you haven't read it yet, you must spend some time with this book. Spend some time with these people, especially Wayne. You will fall madly in love with each person, and you will find it compelling. You will find it emotional. You will find it funny. Get ready for that last paragraph, and I hope that most importantly, this book will inspire you, because it has inspired me on a variety of levels. It's inspired me. I said jokingly about an hour or so ago, I get intimidated about writing. Which I do whenever I read Wayne's work, but I also feel inspired to try to do something great, because being in the presence of greatness is a very inspiring thing. But I also hope that if you're not feeling very connected to your past, that you do a little bit of investigative journalism on your own and learn more about your past. And it will answer a lot of questions about your present, and it might change your future. And I know that sounds a bit trite, but I believe that to be 100% true. The more I understand about my past, the better each day going forward looks to me. So please do read the book, and please do follow the energy that it gives you. And thank you, Wayne, and everybody for having me. This is such a treat. I get to sit here and just kind of
Yes, thank you, Larry. Have a good
my
night.
pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you, guys.